When we speak of the Inquisition, it is easy to conjure up images of black hooded monks torturing and killing people all in the name of Christ. And in the Mexican Inquisition, particularly the stories of the Black Legend, this image is what has persisted in the world's thought, in our imaginations. Or we may think of something like this.
The Inquisition, what a show, the Inquisition. Here we go, we know you're wishing that we'd go away. But the
Somewhere in between those, the Inquisition was not a brutal evangelism tool. It was meant to be a corrective in combating the threat of heresy from within and without the Catholic Church. The historiography of the late 20th, early 21st centuries reveals how a complex mechanism the Spanish Inquisition was. And it reveals that while the Inquisition retained some interest in the indigenous peoples, particularly in the areas of witchcraft and the synchronism of indigenous religion with Catholic traditions, it focused primarily on the actions of those already within the church, European Catholics, converted Jews, and converted indigenous peoples, and with the heretical threats of reformers such as Martin Luther, Erasmus, and John Calvin. I had to throw this slide in. This coming Sunday, October 29th, is recognized as Reformation Sunday in Protestant churches, particularly in Lutheran churches and Presbyterian churches. It will be observed and celebrated. The study on the Mexican Inquisition would be incomplete, if it did not include works by Richard Greenleaf. Now, Greenleaf, in his writings, does focus on the evangelistic attempts of early inquisitors, such as Bishop Juan de Zumarraga. But in his article, Inquisition and the Indians of New Spain, a study in jurisdictional confusion, Greenleaf points out how even Zumarraga came to believe that the indigenous people should be treated differently. And he says in there, quote, Zumarraga realized the frailty of the Indian in the new religion because of inadequate instruction. But he also felt the necessity to deal harshly with those native leaders who, by word and deed, tried to undermine the spiritual conquest. He says that after 1571, the tribunal of the Holy Office acted as a fact-finding agency in uncovering and disciplining of Indian transgressions against orthodoxy. Actual control over Indian orthodoxy reverted to the bishops or the archbishop's office and was placed under the care of the provisor or vicar general of the diocese or archdiocese. In his article on nativism, he argues that during the remainder of the colonial period until 1818, the Holy Office of the Inquisition continued to investigate Indian transgression against orthodoxy. They continued to focus on the Inquisition's treatment of indigenous people over investigations into those of Spanish descent. In that same article, he points out that the Holy Office demanded its prerogatives in prosecuting all manner of mestizos as the Baroque social structure developed along with a Baroque religion. So just as we see in that time frame the development of the castas, the development of those social structures and systems and classes within that, we also see the same happening within the religion. Well, Greenleaf provides us with a very good historical background on the Inquisition in Mexico. These articles lack the holistic vision, which reveals that the main focus of the Holy Office was on those already in the Catholic faith. Greenleaf does acknowledge how native values did filter into the culture and shape the work of the Inquisition. And you see that in this quote here. The Holy Office of the Inquisition in colonial Mexico had as its purpose the defense of Spanish religion and Spanish Catholic culture against individuals who held heretical views and people who showed a lack of respect for religious principles. Inquisition trials of Indians suggest that a prime concern of the Mexican church in the 16th century was recurrent idolatry and religious syncretism. Following Greenleaf's lead, Margaret Maud also focuses mostly on the treatment of indigenous people in her article, The Rule of Faith Over Reason, the Role of the Inquisition in Iberia and New Spain. However, she does acknowledge that the Inquisition played a vital role in the controlling of the Spanish culture and faith in the colonies. You see that in this quote. Besides the persistent theology of the Aztecs and the internal problems of dualism, the inquisitor in New Spain needed to check the hubris of the conquistadors, the Judaizing practices of the conversos, the cruelties of the encomenderos, the liberal sermons of the Erasmian priests, and the Protestant leanings of the English and Dutch sailors. She argues that the Inquisition was a highly efficient mechanism that kept the Iberian culture and hierarchy in place. More contemporary writings have emphasized the Mexican Inquisition's focus on those of Spanish descent, particularly on Peninsulars and Criollos, and the Inquisition's attempts to control the spread of, say, Lutheranism and other, quote, heresies into the colonies. In Ideology and Inquisition, the world of the censors in early Mexico, Martin Austin Nesvig provides a strong theological background on the definition of heresy. And this reveals how the definitions themselves caused issues within the Holy Office. He writes that according to Augustine, a heretic was someone who offers new opinions as a result of his own pride. Someone who offers new opinions as a result of their own pride. Going along with Augustine, they developed that there were two stages of heresy. The first was that the accused had to understand that what they believed violated a specific truth or article of faith. In other words, a person had to know that what they were doing, what they believed, what they practiced, was contrary to the Catholic faith. The second thing that was needed, the second stage, was pertinacity. In other words, they had to persist in those beliefs or practices even after being shown the error of their ways. And this view of heresy is going to contribute to the school of thought that indigenous peoples could not be involved in heresy because they had no prior knowledge that their practices were contrary to the true faith. Nesbig's book focuses on the role censors played in the Inquisition. He writes, censorship and censure formed an integral part of the early Mexican Inquisition. Debates over the education of the Indians, humanism, and the relationship between the diocesan and mendicant control of the church all sparked notable efforts of the control of print and speech. The role of the censors in the Inquisition would shift as the identity of the inquisitor's office shifted to the emerging Criollo elite in the 17th century. He writes, over the next 5 decades, some of the most influential Spanish families with sizable Criollo membership saw either their sons or sons in law placed as inquisitors or legal advisors to the Inquisition in Mexico. He also says that the Peninsular Spaniards and Criollos who compromised the laity in Mexico, as well as the growing mestizo population, developed their own rules about the church. And this is due to the fact that the law does not function outside of culture, and that would help to shift the Mexican Inquisition's focus then to, say, heretical ideas that threaten to come in from other places in Europe. The Mexican Inquisition's investigations into mysticism also tended to focus on other groups in the colonies, except the indigenous peoples. Nora Jaffrey argues that the focus of this was not on the people themselves, but on the ways in which indigenous and African religious practices could corrupt Catholicism. Quote, Mexican inquisitors also maintained vigilance against Christian practices that they perceived Indian or African influences had tainted. And as she says in her book, False Mystics, she shows how the church targeted the devotion of Indian and mestizo Christian groups, but acknowledges that while the church particularly scrutinized all non Spaniards who claimed to be mystics in colonial Mexico, the majority of those who made such claims were white Creoles. Heresy was seen as corruption of the body from within. And so the Inquisition focused on those corruptions that they saw as coming from within, as was the case of the false mystics. But this also would include the use of the Inquisition's tools and symbols by others. In Death by Effigy, a case from the Mexican Inquisition, Luis R. Cortegera provides a blow by blow account of an investigation into the use of an effigy or effigies to insult a person. And the focus on the investigation will be on mestizos, castizos, and Peninsuares, particularly a Spanish royal scribe named Juan de Molina. Cortagera argues that the concern of the Inquisition was not whether a heretical act had taken place, but was actually over the misuse of inquisitorial tools and the use of those tools without the Inquisition's permission. The one area where the Inquisition had jurisdiction over indigenous peoples was witchcraft, as is pointed out in The Witches of Abiquiu, The Governor of the Priests, the Genazario, Indians, and the Devil. Ebright and Hendrick's book deals with the witchcraft outbreak in Abiquiu, what is now New Mexico. Then it was still a part of course, the Spanish Empire from 1756 to 1766. And while the book does deal a lot with the treatment of the Genizaro by the government and by priests, it also shows how the Inquisition was more concerned with what was happening within the bounds of the Catholic Church. They write, the Inquisition, which was introduced in the Americas, was aimed at maintaining moral censorship and purity of the Catholic faith. Any belief that ran counter to Catholic theology was considered heresy, subject to the wide reach of the Inquisition. Thus, Catholics who followed the teachings of Calvin, Erasmus, or Luther, and converted Jews found practicing their own rites were all subject to punishment by the Inquisition. In addition, sorcery, superstition, and folk healing were offenses falling under the rubric of witchcraft prosecuted by the Inquisition. The authors delve into the archives from the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, from the Archivo General de Indias, New Mexico State University, Huntington Library, to name a few. And in their research, they discovered that while the Inquisition did have jurisdiction to investigate witchcraft, that by that time, by the mid 18th century, it was distancing itself from such cases. Quote, as a result of several fantastic cases of exorcism which Franciscans reported to the Inquisition, the Holy Office became suspicious of these head to head battles with the devil, and eventually told the Franciscans to stop reporting them and to cease practicing the rite of exorcism. Ebright and Hendricks also uncovered evidence that the Inquisition was more concerned with the actions of Spaniards in the Abiquiu region than with the indigenous. Quote, the Inquisition was particularly interested in the Spaniards accused of witchcraft, since its jurisdiction over the Indians was tenuous at best. Spaniards, however, were clearly subject to the jurisdiction of the Holy Office. And in a very kind of ironic twist, the area the Inquisition focused on was the work of Father Juan Jose Toledo, who spearheaded the exorcisms, and he was continually sending reports about him to the Holy Office. Father Toledo would end up being, quote, chastened for his overzealous desire to confront the devil. The structure of the Catholic Church itself, and it was greatly explored in John Swaller's chapter in The History of the Catholic Church in Latin America. In the chapter, The Colonial Church, Schwaller reiterates the fact that prior to 1571, local bishops initiated their own investigation into heresy as provided by canon law. Schwaller argues that the Holy Office actually acted more as a branch of the government than as an ecclesial body. He writes the Holy Office focused mostly on suppression of heresy and violation of the sacraments. For example, many foreigners, especially French and English, more frequently came under the scrutiny of the Holy Office under suspicion of heresy than in the royal courts. Political thought was considered merely one manifestation of religious thought. As a result, the Inquisition functioned as a tool for the maintenance of the homogeneity of the body politic. This statement, this theory of Schwaller's, does fit with the Inquisition's attention on Spaniards, Europeans, Criollos, and even mestizos in colonial Spanish America. In his article, Franciscans in Colonial Latin America, Schwaller states that in the mid 20th century, the focus of historians shifted from the religious orders to native and subaltern peoples and their agency within the colonial state. And he writes that these articles mark an exciting new era in Franciscan history, looking at the complex processes that marked the evangelization of the New World. The Mexican Inquisition was also more complex, as is revealed in the historical writings from the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This highly efficient mechanism, as Margaret Mott called it, she's the only one I found who actually says that, was continually struggling with questions of jurisdiction, authority, and even a clear definition of heresy. And in its role in Mexico, it also struggled with the authority over the indigenous peoples. And so the Inquisition would actually limp along for years with spurts of energy and interest until the mid 19th century. But it has left its mark on the Catholic Church in Mexico, as well as on the imagination of the world. The images of hooded monks, tortured chambers, brutalized indigenous people still capture our imagination. But if we're not careful, they can mask this truly complex system that was created to protect and preserve the true faith of the Catholic Church in Spain and in her colonies.